November is really the one-year anniversary of when the US started to ring the alarm bells that Russia was preparing an invasion of Ukraine. November 10, 2021, Secretary of State Antony Blinken stood alongside Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba in Washington, warning that Russia was preparing an invasion of Ukraine in a rehash of its invasion of 2014, when it took over territories in the east, specifically Donetsk and Luhansk, and took over the Crimean Peninsula. It was the memory of Russia's invasion in 2014 that resonated with the Biden administration, and it motivated them to bring allies together to have a stronger reaction if Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to launch a larger-scale invasion of Ukraine this time around. The US set out on an incredible path of diplomacy to try and bring Russia back from the brink of launching an invasion. The US warned Russia not to invade, and if they did, warned of severe consequences by the US and allies. But all of that appeared to be for naught. On February 14th, the US Embassy in Kyiv began evacuating.
We are in the process of relocating our diplomatic staff from Kyiv.
On February 17th, Secretary Blinken gave a dramatic speech at the United Nations Security Council, laying out in stark detail how Russian President Vladimir Putin would launch his invasion of Ukraine.
This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government.
With everything playing out over the next few days almost identical to what Blinken previewed.
Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions.
Russia had amassed 157,000 troops along Ukraine's borders. On February 21st, Putin made the move to recognize as independent the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk. We quickly saw the US and its Western partners mobilize to react.
Today, President Putin made a series of outrageous, false claims about Ukraine aimed at creating a pretext for war. We must act together in response to this crisis.
Germany halted any progress on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, meant to deliver natural gas from Russia to Europe. The US long viewed it as a security threat. This was long a point of tension between the US and Germany. And on February 24th, Russia launched its full-scale invasion, entering from Belarus to northern Ukrainian territory with its aim of capturing Kyiv. I visited Ukraine in August. Russian and Ukrainian forces had reached a tenuous stalemate. I asked Ukrainian officials what was Russia's goal in all of this. They told me Russia's goal is to destroy Ukraine. It felt that way. It's a huge country, but the war was infused in everything. If Russia couldn't defeat Ukraine militarily, it would wear it down so badly that Ukrainians would be forced to capitulate. Everything came to a critical head by September. The Ukrainians had succeeded in putting up a stiff defense against the Russians for about 7 months. The reports at the time were the Ukrainians were moving their forces to the south to launch a massive counteroffensive against Russian forces occupying the city of Kherson. What we know now was that was a bit of a bait and switch. The Ukrainians in September launched a massive counteroffensive on the east, taking the Russians by surprise. The Ukrainian public is facing very real threats to their lives every day, and they say that the only way they can survive is with military and economic support from the US and the West. Both are viewed as critical in the midst of Russia carrying out a new strategy to target civilian infrastructure, water pipes and electricity grids, on top of attacks on civilians in their homes and on the street. All of this support is increasingly under strain given domestic pressures. Countries in Europe and the US are under pressure from their populations over high inflation costs and the price of energy. On December 5th, the European Union is set to put into effect an embargo on Russian oil. One of the biggest fears is if the war drags on, how Russia will use its control of energy delivery to hold Europe hostage. In the US, Republicans are raising the specter that they're not going to be writing a blank check for Ukraine.
I'm very supportive of Ukraine. It means no blank checks for anything.
And progressive Democrats caused a commotion when they released a letter to President Biden that raised questions about their commitment to support for Ukraine. Ukrainian officials and their advocates say Russia looks at these cracks and tries to break apart the unity that the US and its Western allies have maintained so far. At this point in the war, we're at a really precarious time. The winter is going to be the hardest time for the US and allies and Ukraine to maintain resolve. This is because Russia is targeting critical infrastructure of Ukraine, making it harder for Ukrainians to be able to heat their homes, use electricity, or even get drinking water. And if they break down the Ukrainian morale, that will seep into the Ukrainian military's ability to do their job to defend the country and push Russians out.
President Putin seems to have decided that if he can't seize Ukraine by force, he will try to freeze it into submission.
The economy has been directly impacted by the war. And we have, and of this I'm absolutely convinced, a high risk of mortality during the winter months with families and communities who have been left with absolutely nothing.
Millions of Ukrainians have no longer access to electricity. And what Putin is willing to do is to put the country in the darkness in the wintertime. This is a war crime. We don't need to talk about nuclear threats. Using conventional arms, they are destroying a country.
If the American public and the European public cannot withstand the high prices of energy, this could also put pressure on these governments to withhold support from Ukraine and say that that money needs to be invested domestically. Going into winter, as energy prices continue to impact families in America and Europe, it's a big question of whether America and the European Union and the UK can be resolved to reduce imports of Russian natural gas or Russian oil on the market. It's not clear where this war with Russia is going to go. The Ukrainians want to push Russia out of all the territory it occupies, including the Crimean Peninsula, which it annexed in 2014, but is not recognized by the rest of the international community. Pushing Russia out of all of the territory it occupies is a massive military campaign. It's unclear if Ukraine can actually undertake that. Therefore, it feels that the goal is for the Ukrainians to wear down the Russian military to a point where it would force Russian President Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table, and then they can get a ceasefire. It seems that the US and their European allies are hoping by giving the Ukrainians the military might to defend themselves and to inflict cost on Russia in coordination with the sanctions campaign that continues to be imposed on Russia is enough to hurt Putin to force him to the table. But given that Putin has maintained this war campaign, even under pressure from his own public, it doesn't seem like there's any off-ramp at the moment or anyone that's foreseeable in the future. Ukraine's supporters say that pushing for a ceasefire too early would work to the benefit of President Putin, that he would be able to take the pause in fighting to reinforce his supplies and build up his forces to launch an even deadlier military campaign against the Ukrainians. There's always the risk of Putin using a nuclear weapon, and those risks have ebbed and flowed. The Biden administration says it is not witnessing anything on the Russian side that would make it feel it needs to change its nuclear posture. Every day that this war goes on, it really is detrimental to the entire world. And it's unclear if the US can keep its allies on board. It feels as though no one can sustain this war going on for another year.